Hi there. Welcome to the Cyber Savvy Boardroom. Thanks for joining us today. Your hosts are myself, David Himovich, and Anton Shuvakin, both within Google Cloud's Office of the CISO. You can find and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. So Anton, today we have a pretty interesting guest.
Indeed, and the topic is really fascinating, how to present threats to boards without too much sensation, but also without too many details. And we covered some of the new threats and some of the old ones, some of the classics.
Yeah, it was a great discussion. So let's get right to today's episode. Jamie Collier, welcome to the episode. Let's jump right in. You're the lead threat intelligence advisor at Google Cloud based out of Europe. How do you approach the crucial task of discussing threats with boards of directors?
Well, first of all, David, it's great to be here. I spend a lot of my time briefing organizations and boards and risk committees on the cyber threat landscape. And really, the way that we frame this is for any board or any organization to be any good at security, they need to know what they're up against. Now, if you're a board, you're thinking at macro decision-making level, you need to know what your risk posture is. You can't do that without knowing what threats are trying to target your organization. You're making decisions about how much to allocate to your security budget, which again is going to be directly dependent on the sort of threat landscape, the sophistication of the threats that you face, and the controls required to prevent them. So a lot of boards, they'll be making all sorts of decisions around entering a new market. Do they acquire a new business? Do they enter a new region? And all of that comes with understanding the cyber threats in those areas.
So one thing I wanted to sort of drill down into this is to kind of figure out how to avoid the syndrome of board members receiving news about threats from headlines. I think somebody described it to me as a CNN headline syndrome, where they assume that this is the entire truth. So how do you avoid this syndrome? How do you give them the right information, but without too many details?
You're absolutely right. It happens all the time. A senior leader has read a pretty scary article and they're pretty concerned. What I've always seen that as a real opportunity to reframe that discussion, that we see a lot of alarm around, how are adversaries using AI, for instance. And really, I think there's an opportunity with those sorts of questions to pivot into a real evidence, kind of data-driven led discussion on some of these issues. And really, I think if we've got a solid and robust data underpinning the sort of discussion, we can actually reveal some of the issues that are happening right now that are a concern, even if they're maybe not the ones that the kind of headlines are discussing.
So what would be a top threat that boards should be aware of in 2025 now, Jamie?
Well, at a very high level, ransomware is not going away. We see with the data that continues to really trend. For a lot of organizations, they're also dealing with state-sponsored cyber espionage operations. Almost every kind of government now turning to cyber. So we see if organizations are, say, competing with China, if they're in an industry relevant to, say, China's 5-year plan, they might find that they come across those sorts of state-sponsored actors as well. So we continue to see, whether it's in Ukraine, Taiwan, geopolitics driving a lot of the cyber threat landscape. Another thing that is of personal interest to me is North Korean IT workers. So we're actually seeing North Korean operatives trying to get hired at Western organizations, which sounds like it should be in a movie. But what we see with North Korea is, rather than just conducting geopolitical espionage, they're also turning to cyber capabilities to generate revenue for the North Korean regime. That with all the sanctions in place, they've had to be really creative with the way that they raise money for the government. So what we see with these North Korean IT workers, they're getting hired at Western organizations. They're then using that inside access to facilitate the kind of theft of revenue.
So here's an interesting example. You brought up ransomware, which is at least many years old, maybe a decade old at this point, and you brought this North Korean planted insider example, which is really new. So how would you present these to board members so that they can decide what's more important to them today? Because this is something that's 10 years old and very relevant today, and it's something that's kind of 2 months old, at least in public awareness. How do we balance?
So this is a really important issue, and I think it really highlights the way that cyber threat intelligence needs to work together with a broader risk management approach to threat. So the way I look at it is, what we would advocate at Google Threat Intelligence is building a cyber threat profile. So if you think of a Venn diagram where you've got effectively 3 different areas, you've got on the one hand the external threat landscape. What are the prominent threats in your sector, in your region? what are the sort of threats targeting and compromising your peers and organizations that look like you? On the kind of the second part of that Venn diagram, you've got your own technology stack. What systems are you running? What cloud provider are you using? What software is running on your organization? And then on the third part of that Venn diagram, you've got risk and impact analysis. What's really important for your organization? Is it the confidentiality of your data? Or maybe you're a TV network and it's really about the constant availability. And what we're interested in is how those things meet. How are the threats out there targeting the sort of technology that you're running, and how does that then impact your broader strategic goals? And I think it's there that we ensure that cyber threat intelligence isn't just kind of an interesting newspaper talking about all the things going on in the world. It's actually something that is directly focusing on the real kind of strategic goals of your organization.
Yeah, I really like that because I think, board members may not be deep technical experts. So having that type of a profile seems like a good tool to be able to talk about these threats in the business risk perspective. Are there other tools you have that you utilize kind of when talking to boards to think about how do I translate this technical risk into more of a business risk?
I think at the end of the day, it's also about really understanding what's top of mind for boards right now, right? So often what we would find is, as much as I like talking about cyber threats and often think I'm the main character when doing these things, actually we're there to play a supporting role. So maybe the board is currently going through a big digital transformation project. They're deciding how to go about this, at what pace they're going to do a digital transformation. Maybe it's about cloud migration, for instance. So actually, it doesn't necessarily make sense for me to go and speak to a board about what I find interesting. I need to make sure that I tack on that understanding of the threat landscape to their issues. So if it's about cloud transformation, then, they're going to want to know about threats to cloud. How does that change their security posture? Obviously, a lot of benefits to moving to cloud, but it comes with some risks that need to be managed. So I think by kind of tacking on to these other more strategic goals, cyber threat intelligence can be a contributor, but isn't necessarily the lead in a lot of these discussions.
This actually makes sense because some of us who deal with cybersecurity on a daily basis sort of assume that's the center of attention. And this plain supporting role thing is probably quite useful if you're a CISO presenting to a board, perhaps.
For sure. And I think it's also an opportunity for a CISO to actually start having an impact beyond their security function. So if we go back to one of those examples I provided, let's say an organization, working in Asia Pacific is thinking of expanding their manufacturing to South Korea. Well, actually, that might not be an area or a discussion that a CISO is typically contributing to. But what if the CISO can come and say, well, actually, we can kind of deliver some insight on the cyber threats that we see that are really active in South Korea right now. In fact, we can look at the threats that are active in South Korea that have been targeting our sort of sector. And that provides an opportunity for that CISO to really contribute to a much broader discussion around, expanding into a new market or offshoring manufacturing. So really, I think threat intelligence can really be at the heart of some of these strategic decisions that any organization is grappling with.
I think that's great. So time for the drop the mic moment, Jamie. What is one key action that board listeners should take away from this discussion, something that they can do today?
I think it's about having a proactive security posture. So really it's a question for their CISOs, maybe put their CISOs under the hot seat for a minute. And it's a question to the extent that we are proactive or reactive. Are we waiting for threats to target us? And we'll kind of discover them, once they're on our network, once they've created a bit of havoc, they've stolen data, etc. Or do we actually have that threat picture already? And are we actually trying to proactively search for those threats on our network? Have we got proactive security controls in place to stop those threats even being able to get through, moving through our network in the first place? And really, that's where I think boards should be kind of asking questions about a threat-led approach. It's really about moving to a proactive posture. It's about kind of confronting that challenge and accepting the realities that threat actors are going to get it. It's impossible to stop every threat. And let's actually deal with that reality rather than pretend that doesn't exist. And let's understand that these threats are going to get in, but we're going to make it as difficult as possible once they're in for them to move through our network.
Excellent. Well, Jamie, thank you very much for sharing your expertise with us today.
Thanks. Thrilled to be here.